Saludos a toda la afición de Lucha Libre Online. Este que les habla es Michael Morales Torres, integrante del equipo de Lucha Libre Online. Gente, y tenemos el enorme privilegio de presentarles a nuestro invitado especial en la tarde de hoy, de Minnesota para el mundo, pero algunos de ustedes lo conocen como por allá de la Unión Soviética, de Rusia. Nikita Koloff, la leyenda de la industria de la lucha libre, llega por primera vez a Lucha Libre Online. Mr. Koloff, it is an honor for us to have you as our guest. How are you doing today, sir?
Michael, I am doing phenomenal. Thank you. And thank you for having me on Lucha Libre.
Awesome. Thank you, bro. And you also mentioned that you speak a little bit of Spanish, right?
Oh, un poquito, very little.
Well,
I think I can count to 10. I think I can count to 10.
Well, that's a good thing. I mean, the Spanish audience always appreciate you because you have a rich story, specifically in Puerto Rico, and we will get to that. But before everything, we want to know, before you legally change your name to Nikita Koloff, a man called Nelson Simpson existed before. So we want to know, either Nelson or Nikita Koloff, the human behind the gimmick. Who is this man? What passionates him and what drives him in life?
Oh, great question. I mean, obviously, for all of your audience, I'm not from Russia. That was a part of the character, right? I hail from the great state of Minnesota, which I think you might have even referenced at the opening. But Michael, I come from what I would call a very humble beginning that perhaps some of your audience might identify with, what we affectionately called the projects or the ghettos of Minneapolis. That's where my early life began. My mom would eventually move us out to the suburbs of Minneapolis, where I really kind of fell in love with American football and weightlifting. And I'll just pause right there if you want to translate that for your audience.
Perfect, I'll translate this briefly. Nikita Koloff comienza su carrera, su vida en general, empieza en los proyectos o en el gueto, en las zonas más pobres del área de Minneapolis, en Minnesota. Y su mamá, luego de mucho arduo trabajo, logra entonces mudarlos a los suburbios de Minneapolis. Y ahí es que Nikita le llama la atención dos cosas: el fútbol americano, el American football, y el weightlifting o el bodybuilding, que es el levantamiento de pesa. You can continue, sir.
Yeah, so to continue from there, so I fall in love with the weightlifting, the bodybuilding, the football, and I began to, that becomes my passion, and that becomes my vision for my future. I began to have dreams about playing in the National Football League, and of course, building my body and weightlifting was the driving force behind my success through high school and on into college.
Perfect. Él menciona que llega el punto en donde esa pasión por el bodybuilding, por el weightlifting, por ese levantamiento de pesas y por el fútbol americano lo hacen enfocarse en una meta, y es llegar a jugar en aquel momento era la USFL, la Liga Nacional en aquel momento de fútbol americano de Estados Unidos, que era lo que él quería hacer con su vida. Which actually leads me to my next point. Let's talk about your football career. Before you were a wrestler, you were a professional football player in the United States and college football as well. But you play with someone in particular, and we're talking about Joel Laurinaitis, and that's known eventually as Road Warrior Animal. So what do you recall of those early days playing football? That young kid from the projects in Minneapolis that had a dream, finally had the opportunity to conquer them. How was that experience for you?
Well, and just to clarify, I mean, I look back on my high school and my college football career with great memories. I mean, especially in college, I played on some nationally ranked teams in college, and it was there that Road Warrior Animal and I would actually meet. I recruited him out of high school, Irondale High School in New Brighton, Minnesota, to play college football with me. I would go on to finish my college career and graduate. He eventually dropped out of college, and the next thing I know, he's on TBS on the Superstation as one of these wild and crazy road warriors and in professional wrestling. And of course, we were best friends through college, And so for me, it was fun to watch him on television pursue his wrestling career while I still pursued a professional football career. Now, for the record, I had a tryout for professional football, but something preempted me from playing professional football. We'll get to that in a minute.
Perfect. I'll translate this. La historia comienza en su carrera de fútbol colegial específicamente. Comienza a jugar, le va bien, y él es quien recluta a Joe Laurinaitis o Roadrunner Animal para jugar fútbol colegial en donde él estaba estudiando. Pero pasa algo. Al año más o menos de Roadrunner Animal empezar a jugar fútbol, o Joe deja la universidad y drop off college, como él menciona, pero entonces lo ven TBS en televisión nacional y ya no era Joe Laurinaitis, era uno de estos dos Road Warriors, y entonces ahí él hace un tryout en la Liga Nacional de Fútbol, pero algo evita que él llegue a esa liga deportiva de fútbol en Estados Unidos, la Liga Nacional. Which actually is my next question. Like, you were almost about to go pro. You were a huge superstar in college playing football. What stopped you from playing pro at that moment and you know, when achieving that dream?
Yeah, great question, because the catalyst for that, or the reason behind that, was a guy named Road Warrior Animal. And so it was kind of if you want to say, what would be the expression? Turnabout is fair play. It would be, I guess, the expression I would use. And what I mean by that is I would recruit Animal out of high school to play college football with me. Now the shoe's on the other foot. He ends up recruiting me into professional wrestling. And so I take advantage of the opportunity, forego the professional football tryout. And of course, anyone who has followed my career knows that the old cliche, the rest is history. I never look back. My career has a meteoric type of right out of the gate, a meteoric rise, if you will, to where I never looked back at the football tryout because of this immediate success I had in pro wrestling.
Perfect. Aquí pasa algo bien interesante, y es que se invierten los papeles. Nikita Koloff recluta a Road Warrior Animal o a Joe para jugar fútbol, pero cuando Joe se va y no lo ve y lo ve en TBS, de momento invierte los papeles y Joe es quien lo recluta a él, a Road Warrior Animal, a Nikita Koloff, para ingresar al mundo de la lucha libre cuando él estaba así de entrar a la liga profesional de fútbol. Entonces eso es el llamado que él recibe y lo cautiva de esa manera. So Joe or Road Warrior Animal was the person responsible for technically breaking you inside the wrestling industry, but for that you needed to train, and you didn't want to any trainer. You had the opportunity to train with the one and only Eddie Sharkey, like among many other people that's been part of this career you've had. But Eddie was one of the first ones that started with you training with everything. What do you recall of those early days training inside a ring?
Well, and that's a unique part to my story. And I'm not, because, you know, a lot of times you hear, or I'm asked that question, and I have to clarify. Many people assume because Eddie Sharkey trained the Road Warriors, trained with Kurt Hennig, Rick Rude, Barry Darsow, a number of the guys that I either went to high school with or that I knew from Minnesota. And I think there's a natural assumption that he also trained me. In fact, somebody said, well, it's out there on, I guess, I don't know, Wikipedia or somewhere. And I'm not sure who wrote that, because here's the point of clarity. Eddie didn't train me. I actually had zero wrestling training, like no amateur background, no professional training experience at all. The day I walked into Jim Crockett's office, the day he put me on television for interviews, and the next night that he put me in the ring for a match, I'd never even been in a wrestling ring before, leading up to my debut in Raleigh, North Carolina. So somehow I got to figure out how to get Eddie Sharkey's name out of the mix, but it does enhance the story, because I broke in with zero training.
Perfect. Thank you very much, and apologies for that. We didn't know that fact, but let me translate this to Spanish. Menciona algo bien importante. Él dice, no sé si es en Wikipedia o en alguna parte de las biografías múltiples que tengo por ahí escritas, que dicen que yo fui entrenado por Eddie Sharkey, porque pues él entrenó a Kurt Hennig, a los World Waters y la mayoría de los muchachos con los que yo fui a high school, pero no. Sharkey no lo entrenó a él, y esta es la parte interesante de su historia. Él tuvo 0 entrenamiento antes de ingresar a la industria de la lucha libre, una de las pocas personas en hacerlo. ¿Por qué motivo? Jim Crockett se sienta a hablar con él, y entonces de esa manera lo ponen a hacer promo, y de momento ya está en Raleigh, en North Carolina, debutando con 0 experiencia, sin nada por ahí para abajo, y eso es lo que enriquece su historia. And you mentioned a particular name, and that's Jim Crockett Jr. at that point. What do you recall of that first meeting you had with this gentleman? Like, he's such an incredible person, or a huge name inside the wrestling industry. What do you recall the first time you met him?
Yeah, so it's an integral part of the story, Michael, because when Road Warrior Animal calls me to recruit me into wrestling, he shares the storyline of a nephew for Ivan Koloff. And the credit for that story, the ones who came up the idea of a nephew for Ivan were Don Kernodle and Sergeant Slaughter. Well, Don Kernodle approaches Animal and asks this crazy question. Hey, do you know any big guys who wouldn't mind shaving their head and becoming a Russian? And Animal goes, I know the guy right now. So he gives Nelson Simpson a phone call and explains the story to me. I, in turn, give Jim Crockett Jr. a phone call. I have a 5-minute conversation with Jim Crockett Jr. I make sure he understands I've never been in a wrestling ring. I have no amateur background. Is he still interested? And he says, absolutely. Wow. Be in my office on such and such a date with your head shaved bald. And that was and from there, Michael, I didn't have another conversation with him. I just show up in Charlotte the day he says to be there, sight unseen, from just a 5-minute conversation, introduce myself. He takes a look at me. He introduces me to Don and Ivan, and Nikita Koloff is born in the hallways of Charlotte that day.
Wow. I'll translate this incredible story. ¿Cómo inicia esto? Ok, Jim Crockett necesitaba una persona que estuviese dispuesto a afeitarse la cabeza y hacer ruso para unirlo a Ivan Koloff. Y entonces Sergeant Slaughter estaba por ahí en la ecuación, pero Don es quien llama a Road Warrior Animal y le dice, oye, ¿conoces a alguien que se pueda afeitar la cabeza, que se vea bien y quiera hacer ruso? Sí, conozco a la persona. Y ahí llaman, ¿a quién? A este muchacho que se llama Nelson Simpson. Le llaman y evalúan toda esta situación y le dice, ok, yo quiero que Jim Crockett sepa que yo no sé lucha, que yo no sé amateur wrestling, que yo no he hecho esto nunca antes. Si aún me quiere, bienvenido sea. Llaman a Crockett del visto bueno, y 5 minutos, just 5-minute conversation, Jim Crockett dice que sí, y llega él a Carolina del Norte, y allí, en esos pasillos de aquella arena, nace este personaje ruso llamado Nikita Koloff. Like, this is such a rich story, and it's actually about my next question. They told you, or as far as we read in the multiple biographies, that if you trip in the ropes, I don't know if this is correct or not, that you were going to be fired. A guy with 0 experience now has a lot of extra pressure, because if he tripped, he was out. How do you felt, being this rookie with 0 experience, but at an incredible shape, doing something for the first time, not being allowed to miss anything?
Yeah, it was interesting because really when Crockett gave us the instructions to be in Raleigh, North Carolina, the next night at the Dorton Arena, his intention was for us to get there early so that Don and Ivan could work out with me a little bit and show me a few things in the ring. Well, we got there late, so there really wasn't any time to get in the ring. Wow. So I think Crockett maybe started having some some reservations, you might say, or second thoughts about letting me go on television, having not being able to get in the ring, right? So Ivan, to Ivan's credit, he's the one I think convinced Crockett to still let me do it. And it was then that Crockett said to him, okay, I'll let him do it, but if he trips on the ropes, he's history. he's out of here. He's not going to have another chance. Wow. And so in the dressing room, they showed me a couple basic things, how to tie up and what to do prior to going out to the ring. So, yeah, you want to talk about pressure. It was a sold-out crowd. It was hot, and there was plenty of pressure that night.
Wow, I'll translate this incredible story. Nikita Koloff le toca hacer su debut de allí en los pasillos. Se supone que él hubiese llegado antes para practicar con Ivan y con Don. No pasó, pues llegaron tarde y no hubo tiempo de practicar. Jim Crockett empieza a tener sus reservaciones, como que empieza a tener sus dudas, vamos a decirlo de esta manera. Y a Ivan lo convence de que deje a Nikita como quiera luchar ese día. Pasa lo siguiente. Jim Crockett le dice a Ivan, perfecto, se va a preparar el cuadrilátero, pero si la embarra, fuera. Y es como que nunca ha tenido experiencia, practicó nada o bien poco, tuvo éxito y tuvo un debut para la historia porque derrotó a su oponente en 13 segundos solamente. We will get back to the United States in a few minutes, but first let's take a plane and let's go to Puerto Rico, sunny Puerto Rico, where Nikita Koloff had the opportunity to wrestle as well. How did you got the opportunity to wrestle in this island where everything was extremely violent?
Yeah. So you know, let's fast forward from that debut, right, in Raleigh, and as I said, the career was kind of meteoric, right? I mean, it just takes off, and within just a few months, I'm the world tag team champion, the world 6-man champion, and I'm starting to travel now outside of the United States, which brings me to Puerto Rico, and it was there that I made, I think, 2 or 3 different trips there, and the one guy I remember more than anything. And of course, Crockett was working together, I believe, with Carlos Colon, I believe. They were working together on promotions. And so Crockett would send out some of his guys to Puerto Rico. I mean, I went down to the Mid-South for Bill Watts and did some shots. I went up to AWA for Vern Gagne and over to Japan. So I'm kind of on loan, if you will. Okay. But the one name I remember the most was, I think at the time, their heavyweight champion, Hercules Ayala, I believe, right? And of course, he was a fan favorite, and I certainly was not a fan favorite in Puerto Rico going against Hercules Ayala.
Okay, I'll translate this. Cuando hace su debut, su carrera se dispara completamente, gana los campeonatos en pareja, gana los campeonatos de tercia de NWA, comienza a tener éxito. Y entonces, como parte del préstamo de talento y de las alianzas con las diferentes empresas, tuvo la oportunidad de ir a Japón, tuvo la oportunidad de ir a trabajar con Vern Gagne en la IWA, tuvo la oportunidad de ir a Mid-South, y entre los territorios que visita, agarra un avión y llega a Puerto Rico. ¿A quién de todas las personas le toca enfrentarse? Al fan favorite en aquel momento, al campeón máximo Hércules Ayala, y Nikita Koloff era el tipo más detestado de toda la isla, which actually leads me to my next point. Let's talk about the Juan Ramón Lubriel Stadium in Bayamón, packed. Ivan Koloff and Nikita Koloff facing the Invaders at that point, Invader 1 and 3. What do you recall of that historical night where you were highly probable the most booed guy in the whole stadium?
Yeah, well, I was wondering if we were going to actually get in the stadium. I mean, I can recall, Michael, I remember they put like anytime I traveled, they put us in these vans with, you know, the only window was the windshield, I think, and just to protect us, to actually even get us in the stadium, let alone get to the ring. And of course, there's a couple memories I have of the old stories of the little kids selling bags of rocks outside the stadiums. You know, that would become that they could pellet us, you know, with the rocks. And of course, something you and I talked about before the interview, the night I got hit with a spark plug and cut open the back of my arm. And I'm like, I obviously am not well liked here in Puerto Rico. And so I probably was, or Ivan and I probably were, some of the most booed guys on the island. And that's probably what I remember more of, those sorts of things, that even the matches themselves, be honest with you.
I'll translate this. Ivan Koloff y Nikita Koloff lucharon en Puerto Rico en el estadio Juan Ramón Lubre en Bayamón contra los Invaders, los tipos más odiados. Y la primera pregunta de él llega aquí: ¿cómo vamos a entrar a ese estadio? Y aquí viene la dinámica de la familia Colón y de Jovica, en donde los montaban en un van sin ventana, solamente el windshield o la ventana del frente es lo que se veía para que nadie pudiera identificarlos. Pero en la parte de afuera veías niños pendiendo rocas en los sacos para poder atacar a los luchadores. Puerto Rico era un territorio bien activo, bien violento en eso. Eran los tipos más odiados y llegamos a la famosa noche en donde con un spark plug a la parte de atrás del brazo hicieron un tajo enorme a Nikita Koloff. Aquí, antes they also threw with D batteries. The Bushwhackers have not fun stories with everything, but you know, with being with the fans here. But about the positive things you remember of Puerto Rico, do you have the opportunity to go to the beach, to eat some of the food, to talk with the locals? Do you remember anything, you know, good from Puerto Rico besides being the most hated person in a whole building?
Well, yeah, a couple of the measures. I mean, I didn't go outside the hotel room too frequently. Only because I didn't know how I would be received on the streets, let alone how I was in the wrestling arenas. But I do remember, you know, enjoyed traveling to some of the different parts of the island and you know, the beauty of the island, and of course, as you mentioned, the foods. Enjoyed some of the meals we had, but I made it a point not to go out in public a whole lot, just because I did not know how people would respond. So
that was a wise decision. I'll translate this. Él dice, bueno, yo no salía mucho de mi hotel, no era muy común porque no sabía cómo la gente me iba a recibir. Era el tipo más odiado en el estadio. Yo no me iba a arriesgar en la calle a que me dieran un tratazo. Así que sí probó la comida, sí veía la isla mientras estaban guiando. La experiencia fue enriquecedora, pero obviamente por su salud y por su bienestar físico, él no se iba a arriesgar a salir del cuarto. Let's go back to the United States. You were working with Ivan Koloff, and they decided to add another piece to the equation. And I'm talking, let me try to pronounce this correct, Khrushchev, who eventually turned into Demolition Smash or Repo Man. What do you recall of working with him in his early days?
Yeah, so Darcy and I have some history. We go back to high school, where we played on the same football team. He graduated a year after me, so Barry and I were very good friends, knew each other very well. He was actually, we brought him in from the Mid-South. He was down in the Mid-South with Bill Watts, wrestling with another Russian counter, Nikolai Volkov. So he was wrestling down there with Nikolai. Nikolai went up to the WWF. So Barry came. We brought Barry into Mid-Atlantic with us and gave him the name Crusher Khrushchev as our third man. It's part of the six-man tag team champion. And then we could interchange the world tag belts as well. And so really enjoyed the time wrestling with Barry here in the Carolinas. When he informed me he was going to go to New York, of course, WWF at the time, now WWE, he originally asked me about going with him and being a part of Demolition. But in my own mind, Michael, I'd worked so hard on developing the whole Russian character of Nikita Koloff, the Russian Nightmare. I had no interest in going there and with a whole new persona.
Perfect. That's actually, I didn't know that fact, so that's an incredible fact. Let me translate this. Cuando él tiene la oportunidad, él y Ivan Koloff, de añadir una tercera persona, deciden añadir a Barry, que eventualmente fue ese personaje ruso que se llama Crusher Khrushchev. Él estaba trabajando ya en Mid-South con otro luchador ruso. Tenías a Nikita Koloff, tenías a Ivan Koloff, y al otro lado tenías otro luchador ruso que era una super leyenda, que luchaba de hecho en pareja con Iron Sheik eventualmente. Pues cuando él se va con WWF, queda solo Barry, se lo traen para ser el tercer hombre de esa ecuación, y cuando Barry le toca irse a WWF, le hace la propuesta a Nikita: mira, nos gustaría que vinieras con nosotros y fueses el tercer hombre o uno de los hombres de Demolition. Y él dice: yo ya trabajé mucho en este personaje ruso, ya me he esforzado demasiado, he construido todo como para empezar de cero y un personaje nuevo, así que rechazó la oferta. Let's go a little bit back on time. You mentioned it already, but I wanted to talk about that now. What do you recall of that night when you and Ivan won the NWA tag team titles from Dusty and Manny Fernandez in a packed stadium match at that moment?
Yeah, you know, one of the first milestones of my career, right? The world tag belts and of course against the legendary American Dream, Dusty Rhodes, right? And the Raging Bull Manny Fernandez. And so certainly it became a catalyst for what was to come, where we'd eventually win the world six-man or be, you know, have the world six-man titles, eventually wrestle Ric Flair for the world heavyweight title. And so certainly look back on that with fond memories as it, again, further catapulted or launched my already meteoric career to further heights. And so nothing but great, and especially against the American Dream, Dusty Rhodes, right? The legendary American Dream.
Perfect. Él gana los campeonatos en pareja junto a Ivan Koloff. Ellos se enfrentaron a Dusty Rhodes y American Dream y a Manny Fernández. Ganan los títulos de NWA. Fue uno de sus milestones o de sus logros, al igual que muchas otras cosas. Obviamente una leyenda, como él dice, como Dusty Rhodes, simplemente un honor. Which actually you mentioned it, and that's actually my next topic. You faced none other than the Nature Boy Ric Flair in the main event of the Great American Bash in 1985, I believe, for the NWA World Championship. What do you recall of that historic night?
No pressure there. Kind of like my debut in Raleigh. You know, because keep in mind, so if your audience keeps this in mind. So the night I stepped into the ring against Ric Flair, I still at that point have only been in the wrestling business for 13 months. 13 months from the time I debuted in Raleigh. Fast forward just over a year, and now I'm wrestling for the world heavyweight title against, again, another legend of the wrestling business, right? Ric Flair. And he flies in on the helicopter, you know, there's 30, 35, 25,000, however many, a lot of people in the stadium, and I'm the main event. It was incredibly humbling to be in that position, and then to know I'm wrestling an icon like Ric Flair, and I look back on that, once again, another stepping stone that would lead to a banner career for me that I can look back on with incredible memories, including the Nature Boy Ric Flair.
¡Woo! Él se enfrentó al 16 veces campeón mundial Ric Flair. Eso fue en el año 1985, Great American Bash. Como él dice, no pressure, no hay presión. 13 meses después de haber debutado, cero experiencia. Ahora ese muchachito que le dijeron, if you trip in the ropes, you're out, ya de momento va por un campeonato mundial peso completo, main event. Ric Flair baja en ese helicóptero y la cabeza le estalla a cualquiera estando en algo tan enorme como eso. Una experiencia, como él dice, humbling, que lo volvió humilde y le dio la oportunidad a él de crecer todavía más a otro nivel. There's actually a particular storyline or rivalry that many people remember, especially my dad. And I'm talking about the one with Magnum TA. There was, I believe, the best of 7 match for the NWA United States Championship, which actually took you to a whole new level against him. What do you recall of working with Magnum?
And that's probably the number one thing when I go out and do autograph signings and I go out and make special appearances now, probably the number one most, or other interviews, the number one most mentioned thing is the best of 7 series against Magnum TA. Our styles really lined up real well, which is why I think led to such in the chemistry that we had wrestling one another, which is why the fans remember that so well, and the way we told the story, where I went up 1-0, 2-0, 3-0. He fights back 3-1, 3-2, 3-3, leading into that 7th and final match. And so what an incredible memory. Magnum and I are to this day are good friends to this day, and talk quite often. And sometimes we will reflect on those matches. Sometimes for the fans, sometimes just talking with each other, as people post things on social media, etc. So, well, what a history-making series. And you know who gets credit for all that? I want to make sure and mention, once again, the American Dream, Dusty Rhodes. That was his brainchild, his idea.
I'll translate this. Lo más recordado por los fanáticos o en apariciones especiales o en meet and greets o en virtual o en las firmas de autógrafos que él va, todo el mundo le habla de ese Best of Seven, Magnum TA contra Nikita Koloff, el ruso, el estadounidense, el campeonato de Estados Unidos de por medio de juego. Y esa fue esa emoción de que de momento 3-0 y de momento 3 y ya estaba 3-3. Toca el momento de desempatar con la séptima lucha, algo sumamente increíble. Y él dice, quiero darle, todavía lo recordamos a veces para los fanáticos, hay veces que alguien pone un post o a veces ponemos a hablarnos entre nosotros. Son muy buenos amigos entre ellos, Magnum TA y Nikita Koloff. Pero él dice, quiero darle crédito siempre a Dusty Rhodes. Eso fue su brainchild, como dice. O sea, nació de su mente esa idea que catapultó sus carreras a otro nivel. I've read some reports that are conflicting. Some said another thing and the other one said something completely different. I want to just clarify the record. As far as we know, you were originally scheduled to actually win the NWA World Heavyweight Championship on 1986 against Ric Flair, but Dusty decided it was not the moment, or it was simply it was not the moment or something. It didn't happen. Was this actually true? Were you originally scheduled to win the title from Flair?
Well, in '86, so I was kind of if you want to say thrown into that match because of Magnum's accident.
Oh yeah.
So '86 is when Magnum had the wreck and the accident. It's quite interesting. Had Magnum, it's one of those what ifs. If he had never had the accident, he actually was just days away from locking in the deal. He had already been approved to become the next heavyweight champion. So he was days away from that when he had the accident. So, and of course, we were at the height of our, of our rivalry, especially with the U.S. title. Had he never had the accident, I may never have become a fan favorite. I may never have become a good guy, or of course, you say a baby face. We'll never know, because most likely he would have got the world title. And then he and I, just like who knows, there might have been a best of 7 for the world heavyweight title. Right? I mean, that would have made revenue. That would have been I think a sellout everywhere we went. All that said, I was put into the match, but I never officially had any conversations about taking the title from Rick that night. Perhaps Dusty and Jim Crockett were maybe talking about that. However, they never really discussed that with me if there was conversations about that.
Perfect, I'll translate this. Cuando él estaba pautado a enfrentarse a Flair, fue porque Magnum TA, recordamos, tuvo un accidente y quedó fuera de la ecuación. Magnum estaba así, a días de convertirse en el campeón mundial, y lamentablemente pues ocurre eso. Él dice como que pues los what if de la vida, o sea, a lo mejor Magnum hubiese ganado el título en aquel momento, hubiésemos tenido tal vez un Best of Seven por el campeonato de NWA World Heavyweight en aquel momento, entre Nikita Koloff y entre Magnum TA, y él dice, bueno, eso hubiese vendido muchísimo, porque esa rivalidad fue la que llenó las arenas de la NWA por mucho tiempo. Pero volviendo a ese tema, ¿estaba el pautado a ganar el campeonato de la mano de Ric Flair, como se dice en los rumores? Bueno, tal vez Dusty tuvo una conversación junto con Jim allá por el otro lado, que lo hablaron, pero nunca se habló nada con Nikita directamente. Por eso es que él desconoce de esa área. You also wrestled for a while in WCW with Sting, among many other people. But there's one incident, the Vader situation, the clothesline, that basically changed your career. You unfortunately, you were injured and your career changed forever. How do you took retirement? This guy that never had a plan to enter the wrestling industry, that was brought into it, that he fell in love with this, with the fans and with everything, suddenly was, everything was taken away from him. How do you feel at that moment?
Well, it's interesting. Let me interject one other thought on the world heavyweight title, let me just tag a little something on for your audience. So 1986, you asked me about, that match, that question. Fast forward 3 years. Let's go there. Let me go there first. And Flair actually offered me the world heavyweight title, not once, but twice.
Wow.
Of which I'm probably one of the few guys who ever turned it down. Basically, thank you, but no thank you. It was right. It was not long after my wife Mandy had passed away with cancer that he reached out to me, wanted me to come back right away, and offered me that title. So just explain that to the audience, and then fast forward 3 more years to the match against Vader, where I was injured. I had 2 injuries that night, one to my neck, and found out I had a hernia. He's a big guy, right? 450, 500 pounds. And little did I know till the next day that I had suffered a hernia, picking him up for a body slam. But for the record, and for your audience, neither of those injuries were necessarily career ending. I walked away. I decided to retire and walked away during the rehabilitation of those injuries, but it wasn't those injuries that prompted me to retire from the ring, if that makes sense.
Of course it does. I'll translate this for the record. En 1989, Ric Flair le ofrece el título a él máximo de NWA, no 1, 2 veces, para dárselo para que Nikita Koloff gane. Lamentablemente Nikita pues, perdió a su esposa en una batalla contra el cáncer y decide, mira, gracias, pero no gracias. Fue el único en rechazar esa oferta de ganarle el título a Flair, y pues no lo ganó, pero él tuvo la oportunidad de hacerlo en 2 ocasiones. Él no quiso, dándole adelante en el tiempo. En el 92 contra Vader, él tenía ya una lesión en el cuello y tenía una hernia. La lesión que sufre con Vader no fue career ending. Él decide marcharse, pero él sufre una hernia levantando a Vader. Vader pesaba 450 libras, era un tipo pesado. A cualquiera le sale una hernia, pero entonces él es quien toma voluntariamente la decisión de retirarse de acción, y de hecho nunca regresa a luchar posteriormente a eso. Something happened in your life. You became a born-again Christian. What changed in your heart and in your life that you accepted Jesus as your Lord and Savior?
Yeah, so it's a part of my story, and so it's interesting how I made the decision, after the career I had, and you mentioned some of the names, of course, Dusty Flair, Sting, Lex Luger, Ricky Steamboat, the Road Warriors. I mean, there's the list, Rick Rude. I mean, the list of guys, Steve Austin. There's quite a list of guys I had the privilege of stepping into the ring with, winning a lot of titles and belts, and then choosing to walk away under my own terms. And I was at a place in my life, Michael, where I was like, okay, I've reached, you might say, the pinnacle of success. I walk away from a career that most guys would have stayed and probably wrestled another 10 or 15 years easily. And little did I know, during that year, it would have been 1993, that I'm like, what does life hold next for Nikita Koloff? So I've had this wrestling career, and I'm moving on with my life. What does it hold next? And little did I know, 11 months after walking away from wrestling, I would find myself at an altar, surrendering my life to Jesus. Not something I was looking, it's like wrestling. I wasn't looking to have a wrestling career. I wasn't looking to launch into a ministry career, if you will, but the Lord led me and directed me to the altar, and that forever changed my life and what I've done now the last 28 years.
I'll translate this. Nikita Koloff dice, me retiro de la industria en el peak, en el pinnacle, como él dice, en su máximo estado. Pudo haber estado 10 o 15 years más, como él dice, 10 o 15 años más. Decide no hacerlo. Sale de la industria, pudo haber tenido mucho más. Y de momento se encuentra 11 meses después de rodillas en un altar, entregándole su vida a Dios, a Jesucristo. O sea, es algo que él no pensó que iba a hacer nunca en su vida, algo que no buscó, pero que simplemente ocurrió. Recibió ese llamado y ahora trabaja en todo lo que es el Call for Christ y todo su ministerio increíble que él tiene, al igual que el proyecto que él tiene ahora mismo, de hecho, con Lex Luger, llamado Man Camp, que lo pueden conseguir en mancamp.info, which actually leads me to my next point. You've been a born-again Christian more years that I've been alive. I'm 27 at this moment. You've been 28 years dedicating your life to Jesus Christ. But there's someone that decided to be a part of it with Man Camp specifically. And I'm talking about Lex Luger. Not in a million years, no one expected that to happen. Like, we've read the stories from Lex Luger in the 90s, in the 80s, and all he represented and everything, but he decided, to change his life and to be a part of this with you. How's been working with Lex on Man Camp, and what's actually Man Camp? How can people find it, and how Lex is involved in this project?
I appreciate it. And again, my life story, Michael, if I were to kind of summarize my life story looking at this point, looking back, I guess the word surreal would fit right there. Okay. And then the impact that I not only was able to have in the ring, but even outside the ring now in ministry and with other wrestlers, with former wrestlers, Lex Luger being one of them, Sting being another one who is a sold out born again Christian. Magnum TA is a Christ follower. Tully Blanchard. There's a number of guys. Road Warrior Hawk, a year and a half before he passed away, I invited him and Animal to a Christian conference. Hawk would surrender his life to Jesus, and then I would mentor and disciple him for the next year and a half before he passed. I've had the privilege of mentoring Sting. I invited Ivan to a revival where he came and gave his life to the Lord, and he went on to become an ordained minister. So I feel very fortunate that I've had some level of impact or influence because of my decision to surrender my life to Jesus. I have had an opportunity to impact other wrestlers as well, leading up to Lex Luger and us founding Man Camp. And our heart is to impact other men's lives, taking our wrestling careers and the popularity from wrestling and now bringing them to a camp called Man Camp and being able to pour into their lives everything that he and I have experienced in life and how they can be not only a champion in life, but a champion for Jesus.
Wow. This is the work you're doing in the ring, but outside the ring is amazing, specifically knowing the background of our industries, of the industry in general. I'll translate this briefly. Nikita Koloff menciona que él tuvo la oportunidad de cambiar vidas de luchadores con su decisión de convertirse en un cristiano. Comienza la difícil tarea de tratar de hacer que las personas dentro de la industria abran sus ojos y entreguen su vida a Dios. Sting, Lex Luger, Magnum TA, Tully Blanchard, muchas personas, pero hay un nombre específico que él menciona. Él invita a los Road Warriors a un campamento, una conferencia cristiana, en donde Road Warrior Hawk entrega su vida a Dios 1 año y medio antes de morir, y Nikita es quien tiene la oportunidad de guiarlo en todo este sendero, al igual que el mismo Ivan Koloff. Ivan eventualmente entrega su vida a Dios, también se convierte en ministro. Sting, como él menciona, es uno de los nombres, entre muchas otras personas, pero con Lex Luger ellos fundan y crean este proyecto de Man Camp, en donde ambos juntos hacen eso, le hablan a las personas, se sientan, organizan conferencias e intentan cambiar las vidas, abriéndole los ojos no tan solo a luchadores y atletas, sino a personas de todo el mundo y de todas las ideologías, para que acepten a Dios como su Salvador. De hecho, quienes quieran buscar más información sobre el proyecto pueden buscarlo como mancamp.info, mancamp.info. Ahí aparece toda la información, todos los testimonios, todas las historias. todo el proceso para poder unirse a este proyecto mancamp.info o mancamp.info. A todos los aficionados que quieran seguir a Nikita Koloff en sus redes sociales, aparece en Twitter y en Instagram. Twitter e Instagram como @NikitaKoloff1, Nikita Koloff 1 o Nikita Koloff 1 en Instagram y en Twitter, y los pueden seguir en todas sus redes sociales para estar al tanto de todos sus proyectos y todo su diario vivir. Y también tiene un libro, el libro está disponible en Amazon, pero lo pueden conseguir todo en un solo lugar. Koloff.net, Koloff.net, ahí está todo, social media, el libro, Mancamp, el Koloff for Christ Ministry, todo está en un solo lugar y es el website Koloff.net, ahí pueden buscar todo. Sir, before we go to our last question, I wanted to thank you very much for your time. I'm more than humble and honored to have you here as our guest. Last but not least, talk us a little bit about, Koloff for Christ Ministries. What's the work you've been doing and why you decided? So a thing is to be a Christian, but another thing completely different is to devote your entire life to Christ. Like, what motivated you to do this? And let's talk about a little bit about your project, which is Koloff for Christ Ministries.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it, Michael. I really do. And I look again, I'm like, okay, my wrestling career took me to Puerto Rico, took me to Japan, it took me to the Middle East, it took me all over the United States, up into Canada, right? And so that was kind of if you want to say, I like to say it this way, God has a sense of humor. Here's what I mean by that. I didn't dream of becoming a pro wrestler, but I became one. What did I do in wrestling? I traveled all over the world. I flew on airplanes. I rented cars. I stayed in hotels. I talked on microphones in front of cameras like this, doing interviews and entertaining crowds. Now I look back, Michael, at the last 28 years of my life since surrendering my life to Jesus, and I'm like, what have I been doing? Oh, I know. I've been flying on airplanes, renting cars, staying in hotels, talking on microphones in front of cameras, not to entertain crowds. But it was clear to me from the day at the 17 October 1993, the day I surrendered my life to Jesus, a man said to me that he had been praying for me for 5 years every day. And he was there the day I gave my life to Jesus. And he said, God spoke to me and said, pray for that man's salvation. I have a call to ministry on his life.
Wow.
So I had my own plans from days back in the projects of Minneapolis. But on that day, I found out for the first time that God had a plan for my life. And so now I've spent the last 28 years dedicating my life, as you said, to serving Jesus, and that launched Koloff for Christ Ministries. And now you fast forward, Michael, I've been to 30 different countries, all 50 states. I've preached in over 1,200 churches, and Lex and I founded Man Camp in 2015. The vision for Man Camp came about, and now we do a couple of those every year, and him and I do all kinds of ministry together, and we are best friends. And in a million years, as you said, I never would have dreamed of any of this.
God indeed has a good sense of humor. I'll translate this. Él menciona algo bien importante. Dios tiene un buen sentido del humor. Cuando yo era luchador, yo me montaba en un avión, llegaba, rentaba un vehículo, me quedaba en un hotel y hablaba micrófono frente a las cámaras, hablando con un micrófono, y ya, eso era lo que le hacía todo el tiempo. Le damos un poco hacia adelante al tiempo y se encuentra haciendo exactamente eso mismo, viajando en aviones, rentando vehículos, quedándose en hoteles, predicándole a las personas uno a uno, pero esta vez no con un público normal, sino para Dios. Y durante toda su estadía, él dice, había alguien que rezaba por mí todos los días, 5 años. Me dijo, Dios me dijo que rezara por ti y le pidiera por tu salvación. Todos los días, 5 años. Cuando él entrega su vida a Cristo, él Ese hombre estuvo allí con él ese día y dándole un poco adelante al tiempo. Let me place the microphone back. Dándole un poco adelante en el tiempo, él tiene la oportunidad de hacer exactamente lo que hacía la industria de la lucha libre, pero con los ministros, con el Chrysler Koloff. Ha predicado en los 50 estados, en más de 30 países, 12,000 iglesias. La cantidad de personas que han tenido la oportunidad de escuchar su testimonio y de abrirle los ojos y de cambiar su vida han sido muchas. Es amigo, su mejor amigo es Lex Luger, fundan Man Camp juntos y de eso se trata. O sea, la vida no es lo que tú quieras que sea necesariamente. Hay muchas veces que tienes un llamado, que tienes algún propósito en la vida y por más que uno se quiera huir y escabullir y evitarlo, tarde o temprano ese propósito o ese llamado llega a ti, que fue lo que le pasó a Nikita Koloff. I was actually telling in Spanish that you can run all you want from that calling that God and life has for you, but eventually it'll find you and it'll make you good at what you do. That's actually what happened. You were doing exactly the same things, flying, renting cars, hotels, using a microphone in front of people, conferences, but this time is for something completely different, and I really admire your work inside and outside the ring, sir.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it, and I like to say, you know, again, I look back on my wrestling career with very fond memories. But what I'm doing now, if I consider all the championship belts, the thousands and thousands of people I wrestle in front of, 100%, I would say, Michael, what I'm doing now is by far the most rewarding thing I could ever think of doing in my life, and I'm dedicated the rest of my life to do it. And I hope I say this right. I would say this: Gloria a Dios. Did I say it right?
Yeah. Gloria a Dios. Yeah, you say it in Spanish.
Glory to God, right? Gloria a Dios.
Gloria a Dios. Yeah, I'll translate this. Él menciona, bueno, la vida tiene tal vez muchas cosas. Aquí lo importante está en que hacer las cosas bien, el tener el propósito correcto, pero lo más importante es eso, o sea, lo que él menciona, ha hecho muchas cosas en su vida, pero lo que ha hecho en los últimos 28 años con su ministerio es lo más importante que él ha hecho en su vida y gloria a Dios por eso. Mr. Koloff, thank you very much for your time, for sharing your life story, your wisdom, and your kind words with us. We thank you very much for your time. Always wishing you success in your career, in your personal life, and with your ministry. And once again, thank you very much. We're rooting for you.
Hey, it's been my honor to be with Lucha Libre and with you, Michael. And who knows? One of these days, maybe I'll bring the good news and the gospel to the island of Puerto Rico and be able to preach to a big crowd in Puerto Rico one day. We'll see.
Let's hope to see you here, but not as the most hated man in the building, but as the man preaching for God in the building. Nikita Koloff.
That's right.
Thank you very much for your time, sir. Nikita Koloff y Michael Morales Torres para Lucha Libre Online, la marca número 1 de Pro Wrestling y Combat Sports en español.